For those of you who didn't follow the opening session, my name is Julia Leclerc. I'm an advisor in the External Action Service, one of the people who've helped bring this together and also have been involved in the drafting of the EU Global Strategy. So it's a great pleasure to actually see it being implemented and see the Jean Monnet professors so closely involved in this. I've already spoken much more than I expected this morning, and so I will keep my remarks very short now, only to introduce our speakers, and also maybe briefly sort of talk about what we're hoping to do in what's now just a good hour or so. So we have a very distinguished panel here with us to discuss some of the questions that you will have already seen also on the program. It's one of the most highly subscribed sessions. I think it's a fascinating theme for so many reasons. I think the future of global governance is something that's continuously evolving. It's maybe these days being challenged from different corners than we may have been expecting. So there's also some very recent developments that we may want to discuss. As I said, we want all of you also to really be actively involved. So we have a few short opening remarks on specific aspects of these guiding questions. We also have us with here Anita, who will be our rapporteur for the session and has the wonderful but also challenging task to then in our follow-up session present all of these debates and also some concrete policy recommendations. So in your comments that we'd really like to bring in as early as possible, if you could please also keep that in mind. What are the things that we really want to focus in on some of the challenges, and what would you recommend? So to kick us off, here to my right is Filiberto Ceriani Sebregondi. He is a colleague from the European External Action Service, someone who we've been working with very, very closely also on the inception of the global strategy. He's the head of the Development Cooperation Unit in the MD for Global Affairs. And he will be giving us a little bit of a scene setter, where we are, what are the challenges as we see them from the implementation of the EU Global Strategy from our side. We'll then give the floor to Amelia Hadfield, who joins us from Canterbury Christchurch University, to comment a little bit on the aspect of multilateralism in action in implementing the SDGs. I mean, one of the, I think, very good examples of how things have also changed in global governance, that there's a new approach in many ways of shared responsibility, if you will, of also for Europeans to have to now deal with implementing these things. So maybe some signals of how global governance may also be changing. And we then have Jan Wouters, who's the Jean Monnet Chair at Leuven. Thanks also to you for coming today, who look a little bit at the security and trade aspects. I mean, obviously, these are issues right now that are also very prominent, and will then hopefully boil this all down to some concrete conclusions. So without further ado, Filiberto, if you would kick us off.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you very much. Thank you for calling us a distinguished panel. I am the feeling that I don't know whether we are more distinguished than our distinguished audience here. Anyway, going beyond the formalities, I would start by saying that while we, let's say, very often speak of the crisis of global governance mechanism and so on, we are actually in the situation where we have actually a very bold and comprehensive and satisfactory, in a way, policy framework. You mentioned the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. It is certainly one of the boldest policy framework, putting together 17 areas with concrete goals and targets, running from development to sustainability, into including peace and inclusiveness, and so on. So this is something really new and that we should make the best out of it in terms of global governance. Together with that, we have something maybe less known, is the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which is about combining all the financial and non-financial means to promote development, sustainable development, so also mobilizing the resources of the private sector, mobilizing domestic resources, mobilizing, enabling policy environment, and so on. We have the Paris Agreement, which is also the very fundamental agreement to tackle the issue of climate change for the safety of our planet. And we have the Sendai Framework for Risk Reduction and the Risk and Disaster Reduction, which is also tackling specific issues at the capacity of our societies to face a natural or man-made crisis. The global strategy by the EU on foreign security policy is just part of this, let's say, important international policy framework. Certainly, the Sustainable Development Agenda is recognized in the global strategy as a very important cross-cutting element, and the global strategy insists on the importance of building up resilience at all levels, society, states, and even individuals, talk about harnessing the effect of globalization, and also links better our work on security and defense, where Europe must be more responsible and credible, but as Helga Schmidt was just saying, it's not just about security, it's security for something, and actually security for sustainable development is perhaps the best way to define that basically the prosperity and peace of our societies and of our neighbors is the best way to tackle today's challenges. Often it has been said in the global strategy that there are important links between policies of an internal nature in Europe and policy of an external nature. And certainly in the policy framework I've described, there are many of these nexuses. If we look at peace and security, basically we consider that the security of European societies is very much linked to the security and prosperity of the societies in our neighbors and the neighbor of our neighbors, and that this is also, let's say, a precondition for sustainable development. And this is why we want to embark much more in capacity building for security actors, both internally in Europe and outside. With the sustainability of our planet is the same. Supporting green economy is something that we can do in Europe as much as in the relations with partner countries. And by the way, green economy is also the perfect example of what we sometimes call economic diplomacy, which is another way of linking internal and external policies. Basically, promoting green economy is good for the planet, is good for the economy, and is good for our companies, since a lot of the knowledge in the green economy is actually in Europe. So these are just examples that I wanted to put forward in terms of what are these nexuses. And once more, working for the Sustainable Development Agenda means working with all countries at various levels of development. So we have also a large group of middle-income countries, higher-income countries, with which we can work really in a peer-to-peer collaboration to promote sustainable development. The global governance here must be seen also through the lens of the resilience that is put forward by the global strategy, because we need governance at very different level. It is important to have capacity to anticipate and react and exit from challenges and crises at local level, at regional level, at state level, and at international level. This is also why we, as European Union, we work very much on establishing partnership at all levels. Certainly, there is a call to work much more EU institutions and member states together, and we have seen this, for instance, on the migration agenda, a lot of much better coordination and cooperation between EU and single member states. The same EU with, I don't know, P5, if we look at the Iranian deal, or EU with UN, if you see the agenda of reform put forward by the SG Guterres, and the very strong support that is coming from the European Union. And here I would like just to conclude a few words on the UN system and the UN reform agenda. The global strategy speaks about the fundamental role of a global order, of a global rule order, with the UN and the multilateral system at its core. So this is saying that without the global level, we can never, let's say, dream of, a multiplicity of resilient factors that make the globe to be self-governed. We need this global governance, and we need, therefore, to support the effort of the Secretary General to reform the UN system. He has established 3 strands. One is about peace and security, another is about sustainable development, and another is about the management system of the UN. We believe that these 3 strands are very important, but they should be very much connected, each one with each other. And we believe that the important test for the UN reform is what happens on the ground. So what is really important that in every country, the UN system works as one UN with a stronger role of the coordination role of the resident coordinators. And this is a reform agenda that was already present but has not yet delivered much on the ground. We need a much more strengthened, let's say, streamlined and simplified coordinated UN system.
Thanks so much, Filiberto, for the scene setter, if you will, and for sort of drawing out, some of the concrete examples of the substance, of course, of multilateral and global governance, but also for teasing out a little bit maybe the process of what is changing about multilateral governance. And if I can borrow one of the long-time jargon words that we have already since the first security strategy, of course, effective multilateralism means not only going up a level to the global level, but increasingly it also means going, and I don't want to say down, but going to the center of some of the hearts, to the local level, to the regional level, engaging also non-state actors, because of course we can't deliver on the ground if we don't engage all of these levels of governance and all of the different actors as well. So maybe with that in mind, I'll turn to Amelia to talk a little bit more about the concrete example.
Okay, thanks very much, Julia. It's a delight to be here, as ever, especially with something as slim and non-contentious as global governance and the EU global strategy and the European Union. And I'm given 7 minutes to put it all together, so bear with me. I thought Filiberto laid it out very nicely indeed. One of the key points we're trying to look at is the question of reinvigorating 21st century global governance. What is it as a concept? What is it as a structure? And trying to determine the appropriateness of the EU's role within global governance as well. To my mind, that's trying to, however difficult, ensure an equitable approach to managing global public goods and attempting to tackle global ills, just to put it just that simply. Looking at the current framework, I think we have a variety, a sort of an established architecture where we've seen the European Union deal with a variety of success. But I think there's still room for improvement. In terms of the sort of formal multilateral system, the old ones and the big ones, of course, you've got the United Nations and NATO. But the international financial institutions like the WTO, the IMF and the World Bank, now perhaps to some extent beginning to recede in terms of the sort of macroeconomic punch they're able to produce, possibly opens up an area for further European Union actorness. Something the EU certainly does need to do is to push reform within these institutions. There's certainly, they're overdue in this respect. And also much needed interconnectedness between these institutions, not least because many of them underwrite sustainable development, which is a core theme for the European Union in terms of its foreign and increasingly regional policy as well. So I think doing so would help streamline the ethos of sustainable development. After the old big guys, of course, you have a sort of range, regional range of global governance-like structures. And here again, in a sense, the EU possibly comes into its own. There are newer ones like the G20 and older ones like the G7 and the G8. And there are ones that are emulating directly the European Union itself, like the African Union, and perhaps ones that are a little more broad-based, like the Commonwealth, for example. You remember the Commonwealth, do you? Maybe not. Or the Francophonie. And there are ones that, of course, sort of come together in terms of what they used to have on a power basis, like the BRICS, and then ones that are specifically dedicated to particular areas in the world, like the Arctic Council. What's interesting is we haven't done enough work on how the European Union has itself been a public good, operating as a template in a loose way, I think, and also in a tight way for various regional groupings like this. I'd like to see more of the European Union operating as a patron for these specific groupings. More recently, and I think echoed very much in the global strategy, are the very much more informal forums, the newer non-state forums, issue-specific groups, and I'll just use a couple of the Asian examples, for example, the New Development Bank, the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, and the Contingent Reserve Arrangement. Here, again, it depends, I suppose, on your perspective as to whether you see them as rivals to the European Union or necessary counterparts. And if the latter, then I think it's contingent on the EU, dependent on the EU to work more actively to balance with them. And in doing so, I think be very active in terms of constructing, if you like, the understructures of global governance itself. There are areas, topics specifically, where we have not yet seen really enough European Union actorness, and I'm sorry to throw a rather awkward term out, but it's one that political scientists do love. Enhanced EU actorness in institutions, whether it's an EU seat or EU observer status, particularly in areas of maritime security, disarmament, arms control, international criminal law, public international law, and intellectual property, for example. Something I'm going to come back to very briefly is the European Union's ability to lead on digital economy, an area that we haven't seen a lot of regulation on at this point. But I think in terms of climate change and sustainable development, and possibly increasingly migration and also anti-terrorism, there are areas where the European Union can be justly proud in terms of its contribution to global governance as well. Areas where I think a new approach to global governance can be brought about as a result of the EU's sort of methodology of regional cooperation and regional effectiveness. Certainly the sort of bottom-up dynamics that you were mentioning before, Julia, and which a couple of our speakers have also touched on, bottom-up multilateralism. So rather less focused perhaps on the big and established forms of multilateralism, accepting new parallel institutions, particularly with regards to sustainable development, given that it's such a widespread area. Again, playing a complementary role to the ones that I've mentioned before, but I think seeing them also as offering opportunities to the EU private sector. Areas in which we've seen European dynamism, bottom-up trade deals, for example, so not just the sort of default WTO perspective, but trade deals with key strategic partners itself, I think, is a helpful governance term emerging out of EU-GS dynamics as well. Bilateral arrangements, plurilateral arrangements, all of these are sort of catalytic to broader multilateral frameworks, not in a rush, not in a hurry, but sort of in an incremental fashion as well. The use of region-specific agencies, and Europe is replete with them, Europol, Eurojust, EIB, and you see these being emulated around the world, for example, the BRICS credit rating agency. The idea I think that Europe has hit on here is not just agencies that promote the public good across its region, but allow it to have a rather more flexible perspective in terms of working with non-EU members or non-members to broaden that range of connections. And I think connectivity is an absolutely vital, it's a sort of animating spirit, if you like, of global governance as well. The EU, again, I think has been something of a trendsetter in institutionalizing region-to-region agreements. And for me, that's one of the key microcosms of global governance architecture. So I think using trade deals and development deals are very helpful here. And perhaps, as I mentioned before, acting as patron to other regional blocs. I'd like to just finish briefly by looking at, I think, an area that the European Union has had a lot of success in, but perhaps needs to refine a little bit more. And it's in a sense the guiding light of DGAC, and that's of course education. Soft power and the domestic, which I think is a domestic and foreign policy linchpin. I was really delighted, I'm not always delighted to read a European Union white paper, but this one was particularly good. Reflection on the paper on harnessing globalization. I'm sure it's, you know, bedtime reading for all of you, not to put you to sleep, obviously. But I was very pleased to see that within the reflection paper, there was some very neat joined up thinking, and I don't say this lightly, between the European EUGS and the internal and external responses corralled together in this specific document. In terms of sustainable development, before I just go into education, there's a particularly prescient understanding of where the European Union is going to go in terms of developing the consensus on development, which of course has been just released. It goes beyond aid, obviously, and just let me read out a section which struck me very much as forward thinking. The idea of bringing together investment and trade, private sector contributions, domestic resource mobilization, the promotion of good governance, the rule of law and human rights, including a particular focus on youth, gender equality, etc., etc. The EU's proposed external investment plan is to create win-win situations by fostering sustainable growth. That's absolutely it, folks. That's a combination of the norms and the values and the interests of the form and the content of the policy and the practice altogether. And that's in an extraordinarily old and very difficult policy area, not just development itself, but the sort of sustainable development corollaries that have arisen around it in the last 15 or 20 years. Finally, in terms of education, points I think where Europe can afford to go further. It's pioneering enough, but it certainly should put forward, it should push further forward. Digital economy. Again, it's easy to throw this one around, but this is something where Europe, being the biggest market and the most prosperous, has the most amount of substructures here. It can afford to invest more in its education. It can afford to invest more in SME and micro business focus. If it really wants to be global governance driven, it needs to be much more progressive in terms of how it understands education, in terms of how it understands education and culture, in terms of demonstrating its role as a source, education, as a source of jobs and growth, as a catalyst for EU-oriented support of and work with multilateralism. It's not enough just to have Jean Monnet and Erasmus+, and then a great big gap, and then global governance and institutions. We need to start educating and explaining to those in secondary and higher education what is important about global governance, how you build it, and how you manage it. And I think if we can try to bring those two together, then sustainable development and a variety of other dynamics really do stand a chance. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Amelia. Really very much appreciated, despite the colossal challenge of boiling it down, not only to 7 minutes, but really to some very prescient remarks and bringing in a number of very good examples from our own field, if you will, such as maritime security and so on, but also touching a bit on the digital economy education, which I think are really very useful for us. Also, maybe when we're thinking a little bit in terms of tomorrow on cooperating and so on. So, because of course the idea is to also develop this further. So I'll boil it down to a few more ideas that we can take forward. But before that, I'd very much like to give the floor to Jan as well for his comments.
Thank you. Okay, in high speed, 7 minutes. 3 points. My first point is about anti-globalization. Second point is about whether the United Nations and multilateralism. Third point, trade and sustainability. Anti-globalization. I think that when we study global governance and the future of global governance, it's the very first thing we have to take very seriously. There is a strong anti-globalist backlash right now, and I'm afraid it is going to be here to stay. So it's not going to be going away anytime soon. As you know, there are certain links with the rise of populist political players and so on. But I mean, it is there, and what we now kind of see is that for the first time, international institutions start to take that seriously. We have seen, for instance, the reflection paper of the Commission last month on harnessing globalization. We saw, as a preparation for the OECD ministerial conference last week, we saw a very interesting paper, a key issues paper, Making Globalization Work, Better Lives for All, which also really points to some of the, sour points, some of the very important steps to be taken, including with regard to education policies. We have had last week, of course, the new European Consensus on Development, and we have seen also at the level of global institutions a new form of responsiveness, or at least awareness of that anti-globalization backlash. One example, G20 summit last year in September, the Hangzhou Summit Declaration, basically for the first time in the chapter on trade says that we, the leaders of the G20, emphasize, and I quote, that benefits of trade and open markets must be communicated to the wider public more effectively and accompanied by appropriate domestic policies to ensure that benefits are widely distributed. G20, quite interesting. Now you can of course wonder what's the follow-up. Where is the communication? I'm afraid to say that many leaders and politicians still think it's all about communication. In my view, it's not just communication. There are much deeper issues to be debated at a very kind of big debate with our populations. Secondly, domestic policies. I mean, I think that's the big question when you speak to US colleagues. They will basically say, we don't have domestic policies to cope with desindustrialization and so on. So, I mean, I think it's something where also in Europe we have to think. We have much more developed welfare states. There are certain things such as the Globalization Fund and so on. But this needs to be discussed even far more in order to have an answer for this anti-globalist mood. I think there is an additional complicating factor because I mentioned the G20, but that was the G20 prior to the Trump administration. What we now are seeing in formal, but also in informal clubs like the G7 and the G20, that the long-standing consensus may be evaporating. Look at the G7, Taormina, and even before Taormina, meeting of the ministers of trade in Lucca in March of this year. The classical confirmation and commitment of the G20 against protectionism was not repeated because the US trade representative objected to it. We will see what the G20 summit in Hamburg will bring later, say in a couple of weeks. But I mean, there is something of a problem, of course, when even the informal so-called like-minded clubs are not going to be able to recommit themselves to coping with certain challenges. Second point, if I may, whether the UN and multilateralism, it's an obvious thing, but the UN is in a permanent crisis. I mean, that's the nutshell truth about the United Nations, but we need it and we need to re-engage with it. I think it is good that Europe, not just in its treaties, but also in the security strategy, in the global strategy, recommits itself to multilateralism. We have to do that. But it's difficult. Look at the budget cuts. I mean, who is going to stand in when it turns out that indeed the United States would reduce its budget, which amounts to 22% of the assessed contributions to the UN? If that is like reduced with 1/3, who is going to fill the gap? It's not going to be the Europeans, no. I mean, I don't hear much appetite with member states. The more I talk with EU member states, the more they stressed, well, we should stop always putting money in this kind of limitless pit. I mean, everybody's talking about more value for money, and I'm not sure who is going to fill that budgetary gap, but it will be there. And then there is the reform issue. We need to reform the UN. 70 and more years, it's constantly in need for reform to the 21st century's needs. The Security Council is, of course, epitomizes the great need for reform, but where there is no international consensus and worse, no European consensus. And that's a little point I would like to drop for our discussion. What about the impact of Brexit? We will have one of our member states who happens to be a permanent member on the Security Council. If that member state leaves the European Union, what should we, the 27, do with that? My view is that we should start much more coordinating our actions with member states that are sitting in the Security Council, find more consensus also on Security Council reform. We have to get our act together. If the Europeans don't get their act together with regard to Security Council reform, I'm afraid the international community will not do that either. Another thing, because we are always boasting in the world that we are contributing more than 40% to the UN peacekeeping budget. You know, in every speech of one of our EU leaders, this comes back. You should look at another reality. How much are EU member states contributing to UN peacekeeping troops? And the real figure is 3.5%. That figure is not mentioned in all those beautiful speeches. It is actually very dismal. We prefer to pay rather than to send our military into UN peace operations. So I think when we are speaking about the further elaboration and dynamics of CSDP and European capabilities, we should really also think about much more, say, involvement, not just with money, but also with troops in UN peace operations. Development, sustainable development, yes, great dynamics of the SDGs, but look at the underlying institutional framework, it's desperate. This is difficult. I mean, ECOSOC, the high-level forum, and so on, these things are problematic, have never functioned really well, and we really need to take a look at it, how we want to make sure that Agenda 2030 will be properly followed up. Human rights in the UN, ongoing issue. You know that 2006 we created a new Human Rights Council in Geneva with strong support of the Europeans. But look at the Human Rights Council's record. It's very mixed. There are always politics going on, and you could say that's natural for such an institution. But we have to be aware that the Europeans are a small minority in the Human Rights Council. And now again, the fact that the United States is disengaging will be very problematic for us. Last week, Nikki Haley was in Geneva and gave a speech, brief intervention in the Human Rights Council. She mentioned a couple of conditions to which the Human Rights Council's work would have to, comply with. Otherwise, the United States will simply withdraw. And so there we are also in difficulties, and we should not forget that it is increasingly difficult for our EU member states to agree on their priorities in the Human Rights Council. We should also look at the internal divisions within the EU in that respect. Last, if I may, trade and sustainability. I think there, as I said, the global system is in crisis. WTO is not delivering on the Doha round. I'm afraid that even the last kind of bastion of effectiveness in the WTO, which is the dispute settlement system, is now under threat. There have been, even under the Obama administration, very strange maneuvers by the United States against the appointment of appellate body members. I'm a little bit afraid that this will not improve under the Trump administration. So the rule of law at the level of the WTO may be imperiled. That's one thing. Other thing, we know that since Doha is not delivering, many countries and many actors, including the European Union, have, of course, more than 10 years ago started to rush towards bilateral, deep and comprehensive trade agreements. And we're still doing that. And I think it's important that we continue to do that. But what has happened last year in the autumn with regard to the CETA agreement and all the somewhat, let's say, folkloristic details about what happened in Namur and the Walloon Parliament and so on, but these things need to be taken seriously. I think that if you readdress the point of anti-globalization, and if we really want to stay a prominent actor with regard to global trade governance, we should really very seriously investigate what is wrong and what our populations have started to dislike with regard to global trade. I think the Commission reflection paper is a good start. But you should compare the pages where it mentions the advantages of trade versus the one paper where it mentions that some people are against trade. I think we should just engage with the negative arguments, and we should really show them with reliable figures, with recourse to independent experts, that indeed overall trade is good for us. And then, of course, we need to engage with audiences about non-trade values. How do we bring labor, environmental standards, human rights, and so on into the trade picture? The Commission has done a lot of things in compliance with the Lisbon Treaty to integrate those elements in the new generations of trade agreements. We do have the so-called sustainable development chapters, but their enforcement is extremely weak. And we, I think, need to do some serious thinking about how to better enforce those sustainable development chapters. We have recently done a study for the Dutch government in which we explored a couple of options in that respect. Last but not least, the CETA episode and what happened with the Walloon Parliament, I think, also shows that there is the issue with regard to the need for more consultation, more transparency, and democratic oversight. It's interesting, if those of you who want to explore this further, there are two somewhat opposing declarations that have been made by academics and civil society actors. There is the Namur Declaration, which, as you can imagine, follows the line of the Walloon government, and there is another declaration made in response to that, Trading Together. And we don't have the time to elaborate that here, but I think it would be really worthwhile to see what arguments both sides are using, and both sides have part of the truth. It's not that one is foolish and the other is not. I think we just need to discuss this more deeply. For instance, when it is about impact assessments of trade agreements, we need this being done by an independent agency, and we don't just need an impact assessment ex ante before the negotiations start, but at the end of the negotiations and during the lifetime at regular intervals of a trade agreement. In that way, you can continue to show your populations how they are functioning and what is probably wrong or should be addressed and should be remedied. But this should be done by an independent agency and not by, say, services in the Commission or so. I think we really there need to create more trust with the populations. Last but not least, democratic oversight. I know the European Parliament has been given very important powers under the Lisbon Treaty, and I think it's a very important breakthrough, and we should capitalize on that. We need EU-only trade agreements. But it will not happen anytime soon because there will still be an element of mixity. And you will remember that member states like to drop that mixity in trade agreements in order to still have a role in ratification processes. As long as that practice continues, I think we will need to find a sound and intelligent modus vivendi between the European Parliament and national parliaments. Let them work out a positive way of engaging with each other. And this is not without precedent. In the area of security and defense, in the area of the Fiscal Compact Treaty, we do have indeed nowadays those so-called interparliamentary forms of cooperation. So we can indeed tap on that with due respect for everybody's competences, but I think we need to deepen a democratic oversight and consensus on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jan, for also boiling it down to these three important elements of anti-globalization, which I think is really an important context also for our debate. Today, as you said, this is something that's moved very much to the forefront of decision makers' attention. It's of course a phenomenon that we've seen for many, many years, so I think it's about time, and of course it's, as you've done very well, also connected this to the other issues. So what does that mean for how global governance works, and the particular example, of course, of trade, which we've also seen here in the EU when it came to ratifying the CETA agreement with our Canadian partners. And I think there, on the last point of sort of democratic accountability and maybe also communication aspects, indeed, I think it's, of course, communication is crucial, but we need to recognize, of course, that it goes much deeper than that as well, and some of the policy challenges. And of course there, it'll be interesting to see, do EU-only agreements are the way forward, or the fact that member states still have a way in. I mean, maybe that's not just to block an agreement, but also to enable actually this kind of democratic debate and the participation, and also for all stakeholders to really make that argument. And there I think we can extrapolate not just to focus on trade, but what are actually the concrete benefits of globalization, and bringing in that a bit more. I think that's maybe something that's been missing, and this kind of concrete engagement with the arguments for why some people and some perhaps rightfully, some perhaps less rightfully, see this also as a challenge to their way of life and so on. So thanks very much for that. I think we really have a sort of broad scene setter for a broad team and very little time to boil this down, but I see Anita's already actively scribbling away. What I would like to suggest is maybe to boil it down to three aspects, to also bring all of you and to focus your comments on those. And that would be, first of all, what should be the focus? What should be the issues in driving forward global governance and more effective multilateral governance? Should we, as the European Union, be really an active driver on all these issues, and we've heard now really from maritime security to education, the obvious ones, of course, such as trade, such as climate change, or rather the opposite. Should we, given that time and resources are limited, should we focus on 2 or 3 things and say, this is the EU agenda, this is how we're going to make it work? That I would say is the first cluster. The second one, who are our partners in doing that? And here I mean both regional, Amelia, you've already mentioned that, who are regional organizations who will be our partners in driving ahead things such as UN reform, but of course also WTO, other institutions, and maybe even the G20 and so on. So how do you connect these? And then, last but not least, what should be the process? I mean, UN Security Council reform is one very obvious example that's been much debated, that in many ways isn't getting any less controversial, if I may say it that way, and more complex due to reasons also connected to what's happening within the European Union and Brexit, of course. One of our members on the Security Council actually leaving, but also due to the things that we just heard on sort of who are the actors these days and where are the fora? I mean, do we need to go into different kind of formations? How do we engage not just the anti-globalization movement, but maybe also supporters of globalization, but on the sort of non-actor level, the non-state actor level, to bring them to the fore. So if we could maybe start on the focus and the issues. If I could ask those of you who have remarks to make on those, I'll collect on those 3 and then maybe give back to the panel as well. I already see, if you could also briefly introduce yourself, please.
Okay, my name is George Zestos, and I come from Virginia, United States, origin Greece. My specialization is in international economics, European integration, and everything that this panel spoke, I attest to it. I mean, you're brilliant, you're good-hearted, and you want a good for Europe, for your countries, and for the world. Closer. Okay, I thought I had a strong voice, and students say they don't need a microphone. Okay, so if I magnify what you suggest by a factor of 15 or 20, we solve all the problems. We cannot magnify that. We cannot do that. We cannot multiply by 15, so the beautiful ideas we just stated can be applied. So we have to ask a practical question. Why can't we? Therefore, we need to look at ourselves as Europe. Why is Europe is not embarking those projects and improve things within Europe? You know, since 2010, it was a disaster here in Europe. We had poverty, we had raising of extreme parties to power, gaining popularity, and so forth. And the very foundation of what Europe and the EU is built is at trouble. Therefore, we need to ask very, very strong question, why those things happening? And we should not be afraid to say, this should stop. Don't do this, whoever you are. And I can tell you one thing, the Commission and the people in Brussels, they have nothing to learn. They know everything. They're the best people. And you have the ideas. Neither the Jean Monnet professors that we are in the offices and we try to do research and we know what's going on. But somewhere it's stopping. And so if we can point it out that this is what is stopping, and everybody, just about everybody knows, it's called populism. It's in political arena, where politicians promise the voters to do that, and so they can get re-elected. And whatever they promise is not working. It's not a common public good. EU should be a public good. Public good means everybody gets benefit, not just one party at the expense of others. You're talking about trade. We cannot have trade, international trade, with perpetual trade imbalances. They have to be corrected for the good for everybody, for all countries.
Okay, thank you. And thanks also for kind of highlighting something that actually Filiberto kicked off with, is a sort of internal-external nexus, that of course we are only effective at promoting global governance if we also have some internal reforms and live up to our own standards. And as many of you have probably seen, that's actually at the very outset of the global strategy, and one of the key arguments it makes is that we also have to look at how we function internally to push all of these agenda issues forward. Something else on the specific focus, everybody who would like to highlight, I see two now, so maybe both of you, three. Okay, so if you can keep it very short, and then we'll go, because we still have two other issues as well. Please. Yes. Would you like to start? Yes. And there's a mic just there.
My name is Maria Grazia Melchioni. I'm a Jean Professor of History and of Sapienza University of Rome, retired. Now I'm the editor of a journal, Rivista di Studi Politici Internazionali. Well, my proposal is connected to the UN reform, to the topic UN reform. On the international stage, the projection of the EU, which is prominent in the economic trade field, is not powerful enough to have the influence it deserves in political affairs. In the provision of a future possibility to apply for membership of the Security Council, when reform in the UN may become feasible, there is an urgent task that could be tackled concerning the presence of the EU in the Security Council. In fact, as in the present state of affairs, it is not possible to envisage the EU becoming a full member of the Security Council, it is possible to envisage the presence of the EU as permanent observer in that body. In this case, the EU representative could be present at the meetings and eventually be consulted. Moreover, when on an international problem there is a common position of the EU, the permanent observer would be asked to present it to the Council, and that would give the EU a political visibility at the UN level. And what is more important, in this perspective, the member states would be encouraged to reach a common position. In 2004, an initiative aiming at this purpose has been taken by Italian diplomacy without success. However, acting all together and also individually at the UN level, the 27-28 member countries could achieve this preliminary, crucial goal. That could not be a problem of procedure. If there is the political will, the procedures follow up. And I would like to add just a short comment. The Today EU is not a simple international organization, but a union of states and peoples with an important institutional structure, including an high representative for foreign security policy and the diplomatic service, and even military intervention forces which operate also at the request of the UN. And this situation was not there in 2004. Since 1977, the EU has the role of observer at the summit of G7. At the Arctic Council, they are waiting for a signature to welcome the EU as permanent observer. And this would be another important step, because the collaboration in the Arctic region has become a crucial issue. So why could it not be a permanent observer at the UN Security Council too? Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for making this very concrete suggestion and also being as innovative about it. Okay, so two more here and then there as well. Since you're standing there, why don't we take this intervention first, if you don't mind?
Yeah, two very short points, one on anti-globalization and the other one on trust. Anti-globalization, let me remind you about the famous Roderick's trilemma, which connects globalization with democracy and national sovereignty. So maybe people or groups in the world, and not so much against globalization, but more concerned about democracy and the loss of national sovereignty, and very probably that will give some clue to understand things like Brexit. And the second point regards trust, the issue of trust. I think it's a basic point. I think you mentioned it, and I would like to ask you if you have, I think we, in the way I see it, I think we have a desperate problem with institutional trust, not only in the European Union, but in the world, in national member states, etc. Here and there. So I would like to hear your reflections on how to try to overcome this important problem. Thank you.
Okay, think over there, please.
Thank you. My name is Miklos Losonc. I am from Budapest Business School, University of Applied Sciences. Before highlighting my rather pessimistic view on global governance, let me ask a question. What shall we mean by global governance? One possible answer could be that global governance is more or less equal to the strengthening of multilateralism, multilateral institutions. If we perceive this term in such a way, I am rather pessimistic whether or not multilateralism can be strengthened. For example, Russia is not interested in any reform of the Security Council of the United Nations. Or is China interested in being involved in multilateral treaties, multilateral organizations? Maybe to some extent, but basically the Chinese external economic policy seems to be, at least as I see it, different. So the United Nations, the policy of the Trump administration is quite obviously against multilateralism. So the external constraints are rather significant. The other perception of global governance could be the Europeanization of the rest of the world. That is the transmission of the values of the European Union as it has already happened in the external economic relations of the EU, enshrined in the basic treaties. So to represent the principles and basic values of the EU. The internal constraints are also rather significant. Much has been said about the two-speed integration or differentiated integration, but I think some hopeful trends are on the horizon, and I think this kind of attitude could be much more useful to strengthen economic cooperation among a certain number of member states, and this will have some impact on global governments. I rather hope so. Another, I failed to mention the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union, again a separate issue which should be dealt with somehow and considered in evaluating global governance. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and I think that already led us a little bit into the questions, of course, who will be our partners in driving forward multilateral governance. Of course, if we look at the issue of climate change, will it be less of the US and maybe more of China and so on? But before moving over to that, is there anyone who'd like to say anything about concrete issues that haven't been covered? At the very back, please, and here, and then if you could really keep it very short, because then we do want to touch upon those issues still as well.
Thank you very much, Danuta Kabadrudnicka. I wanted to say that the condition sine qua non for thinking about the global role of the European Union, it is to build the European Economic Union. To build economic foundations of the European Union, because otherwise the whole structures will fall apart. If we do not have the strong foundations, as you know, we do not have economic union. We do have freedoms, we do have policies, but we do not have economic union, and it is the condition sine qua non for the role of the European Union in the global world, and for European monetary union as well, for European currency. It is the one thing, and another thing is that the European Union must be more open towards the other states, towards the international law. As we know, European Union is withdrawing itself from this role. We know here the well-known, famous judgment CADI, when the European Union said no. European Court of Justice acted as national constitutional courts act as far as European law is concerned, when they do not want to stick to the European Union law. And the European Court of Justice did the same. And then briefly, I see here two issues. One, it is the strengthening of the economic foundations of the European Union, to think about as a condition sine qua non before thinking about the global role of the European Union, and then to mere openness of the European Union towards the international law. And just briefly, the third issue is, it is a question to you, what do you think, what should be the role of the European Union? We now see this competition between two powers, United States and China, and what is the role of the European Union? Is it a kind of adaptation, or European role, the role should be, the role should be different. I mean, the role should be taken by the European Union, a kind of negotiation between those two powers. What would be the future, the role of the EU in this competition? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I think, again, we've already gone to cover the ground of the other issues. That's great. If we could have the mic, please, to the same side here, the third row from the front.
Neva Macher from Faculty of Business and Administration Science in Novo Mesto. I also agree that economic issues are very important because globalization in economic point of view, in fact, means global competition, global business competitions in which two components are very important. One is innovation, and innovation was not mentioned today. This new concept of innovation and social innovation, and the other important part of global business is marketing. Europe is, as Amelia Hadfield said, really very important and big when investing in education. And at the same time, you mentioned European Union is weak in intellectual property rights. Why I mentioned all this, I will be brief. Innovation is the basic driver of jobs and growth. And we are investing in education, but not to stay only beside knowledge. We must turn, European Union must turn knowledge to know-how and to create intangibles and to capitalize intangible property. To make and to protect intellectual property rights is very, very expensive. But as Mr. John Water said, it is not transparent. Many things are not transparent, and especially what is not transparent within European Union is all this long way from investing in education to the end, which European semester stresses, how to come to more jobs, how to come to growth. And we must know that in European Union, small enterprises create over 80% of jobs, not corporation. But when we speak about marketing, corporations are leading, and they are leading in performing intangibles, trademarks, brands, licensing patents, and so on. So, just to finish, sustainability and also management as Mr. Ceriani said, these are two important fields, and I see this Jean Monnet community very important with its knowledge and experiences to make transparent all the system from investing in education to come to the end to intangible capitalization. Thank you.
Thanks to you for also connecting it again to the concrete contribution that you can make.
Hi,
please.
I'm Jarno Pikalan from University of Ljubljana. Two things. First, anti-globalization or anti-globalism. We have to be precise and careful about it. Globalization is a process, globalism is an ideology. And if we want to be really precise what is happening at the moment with populism and so on, it's anti-globalism movement. It's not anti-globalization. So we need to be precise. It's Ulrich Beck's work in general, but I think we need to be precise. Secondly, when we speak about global governance, I think one thing that needs to be mentioned is multi-layered global governance. That is on various levels. We were speaking about, multilateralism, but that's only on one layer, and that is on the state layer. In this world, we have multi-layered global governance, and what European Union needs to think about is to which layers and in what extent will it work in terms of global governance, because we have local, we have state level, we have regional level, and so on. I mean, all levels need, in a sense, they need some kind of regulation, but then we would have to think how far, to what extent, and in what ways do we work with global governance in these various layers of governance. Thank you so much.
Well, that's what I was hoping that some of you would also answer in our discussion. So for those of you who want to pick up the baton, please do so. In the meantime, we'll have another question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Kirsten Ingalls, and I'm Scottish, but I'm representing University of Sao Paulo. I just wanted to add to my colleague's comment about innovation and how Horizon 2020, which is of course the driver behind the 10-year blueprint of the Europe 2020 strategy, initially all the consultations for Horizon 2020 and innovation in science research was focused very heavily on international cooperation. And in the end, while the budget is 82 billion, the international cooperation dimension of routing the research was dramatically reduced. But if you look at the initial consultation on FP7 and the responses, which I was also involved in, there was a heavy support by the European Commission that was watered down again by the member states in the final documentation, moving away from the incorporation of developing countries and emerging economies in the final program.
Okay, thank you very much. I see another contribution on the same side in the back, please. I think we've moved now to the second and third point as well. So for those of you who'd like to make a contribution on that, preferably those who haven't spoken yet. So, and particularly again, who are the sort of interlocutors, who are the partners, and what we've just heard from the last remark also, where are the levels of governance where we should engage. So please first.
Hi, Nuno Cunha Rodrigues. I come from the Law School of Lisbon. It's just a small question, because we see that the global strategy mentions that the emergence of protectionist policies worldwide. The BRICS are following protectionist policies. The United States are now starting to follow protectionist policies. And I'd like to know what you think about the role of the EU. Is the EU prepared to face protectionism from those countries, from the BRIC countries? Do we, European Union, have enough legal instruments to face protectionism, namely according to reciprocity principle? Because the WTO system is not working. EU is a traditional client of the WTO legal system and the dispute settlement mechanism, but it's not working nowadays. And I think that the European Union doesn't have enough legal instruments to reply those countries, such as the BRICS and the United States. So are we preparing ourselves to do that? Because usually the European Union has kind of a soft approach to protectionism, not a hard approach. So I'd like to know your opinion about eventually following kind of a hard approach, providing the European Union with the legal instruments to answer those countries such as the BRICS and the United States. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So something on the process as well. Here in the middle, the two gentlemen, please.
Emil Kirchner, Jean Monnet Professor, University of Essex. On your second point, you talk about who are the partners. Basically, we had strategic partnerships, of which we have 10. And the question is, what is really happening to them? They are supposed to be very integrated, very close. Are we still wanting to make use of them in one way or another? Or are we sort of now looking much more at some of the emerging topics like global governance or global trade, globalization, or climate change, or to some extent the new Silk Road, which the Chinese are offering? In other words, are we sort of saying, look, the 10 partnerships we had, strategic partnerships, are something of the past, and we really concentrate on individual partners, like China, for obvious reasons, and prioritize. And it's really the priority which I find is missing. We're having a huge bag of aspirations, but unless we prioritize, and this is what recently the Chinese have done finally with regard to the Silk Road, set priorities, what are the projects, in which geographic regions are we trying to operate, and then we really move from aspirations to practical results. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and that's of course also something that we're trying to do with the global strategy, and hopefully something we can take forward.
Thank you. Patrick Holden, Plymouth University. About partners, as has been mentioned, regional organizations are obvious partners, but I fear that relations are often poisoned due to the trade diplomacy, which is inevitably quite tough at best and often quite poisonous. So I wonder if in ways the EU needs to be a bit less holistic sometimes in developing relations and having a separate trade track and trying to concentrate more on more flexible forms of cooperation. And briefly about the SDGs, they are of course incredibly broad, and again there's a danger that this leads to a bout of navel gazing and mapping and process tracing within the EU, and hard thinking needs to be done about the priorities, roles and responsibilities of the EU institutions as opposed to member states and business, and like I said, not trying to do everything or falling into the old trap, which is the opposite of what the global strategy was going for. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I see Anita is fervently scribbling away and already putting out some concrete results of our debates. Before handing the floor back to our wonderful panel, is there another pressing, I see one here, and I know you also wanted to make another comment on partnerships 3. Okay.
Alfredo Rizzo from La Sapienza, Rome, La Sapienza University, Rome. Just one question directly for Professor Wouters, a legal point regarding the recent judgment of the Court of Justice dealing with the EU-Singapore agreement. What is his feeling regarding the legal consequences and the splitting of competences between member states and the European Union according to the judgment? Just in brief. Thank you very much.
Hardy Hanapi from Vienna, economist, University of Technology. I have a concern with the globalization concept in general. I think in the production sphere we do have globalization. We do have global value chains. So their globalization is there. We do have globalization in the information sphere. So we all look at the same soap operas around the globe. Where we do not have globalization is the political sphere. So there we have nothing. There's a vacuum, so to say. There are continents, and I think what happens right now is that Europe is cannibalized by authoritarian systems. In the US with Trump, who is going for bilateral arrangements with single European states, Eastern European states in a similar way by Putin, and authoritarian systems, 3 authoritarian systems globally now are confronted with a Europe that is split apart, does not have, there's this global vacuum. The European Union is not in a similar authoritarian position. Hopefully not going into that direction, but therefore comes your first question, what should be the focus? The focus should be to produce here an internal, I always call it in my books, pilot project Europe. A pilot project Europe that is not authoritarian, that is not cannibalizing others. And therefore our main task would be to reinvent to some extent our internal structure, political internal structure, the voting system, the internal division of labor within Europe. All these things partly in your topics should be very much on the agenda. And where should we start? Where should we focus? This is a European monetary financial architecture, which we have started already quite neatly with the introduction of the euro. I was there when there was the question, should we have first monetary union or first a fiscal union? And surprisingly, one started with the monetary union to a large success in my view. And therefore, this reconstitution of Europe should also start with the financial architecture of Europe, giving a large Marshall Plan credit to North Africa for improving the migration situation in the mid-run. Thank you.
Thanks. Again to the front, please.
Yeah, thanks. It's a reaction to your comment, and also in addition to what I just said. I think the problem is not so much whether we are before of different layers of democracy, which I perfectly agree with, but whether democracy is compatible with globalization, and I think that's the point. I mean, if we take Roderick's trilemma seriously, it really assumes that globalization is not, or democracy is not compatible with globalization, and I would like to hear your views on that. Do you accept that structure, or do you really think that globalization could be compatible with a form that doesn't exist now but could be invented maybe in the future of democracy? Thank you.
Well, thanks so much to all of you. I think we've had a very broad debate, but also some very nice interconnections. I mean, one of the main things that I take out of this is that making globalization work and making it fit for the 21st century, as the global strategy proposes, really starts at home, I guess. So some of the things that we can do internally. Then maybe picking up on the last two comments, I mean, is democracy actually fit for globalization? Does it maybe need to be reinvented? And are there things that we can do to make it more compatible with it? So that's also one of the ways of how do we address the anti-globalist sentiment, and thanks for all of those comments. I'm not going to ask you to react to all of these comments, so please do feel free to pick out those that you feel are sort of that you can speak to best, and maybe also teasing out a little bit on the policy recommendations. I'm speaking here particularly to our two professors. So I'd say we start in reverse order. So maybe Jan, if you would like to kick off on some of the remarks that struck you in particular.
Well, thank you. Un cadeau empoisonné. How much time do we have? Because in fact we're already 20 minutes late for the global.
look at the coffee break area, I see that there aren't crowds of people stealing all your cakes and coffee, so we have a few minutes each, I'd say, to wrap up.
Okay, good. Fine. I didn't see a coffee break schedule, but first, Security Council. I love the point that was made by our Italian colleague about making the EU a permanent observer. However, it's not possible because the Security Council doesn't have observers. Other United Nations bodies, like the General Assembly, like ECOSOC, like quite a number of the programs, funds, and specialized agencies, yes, they have permanent observers, and in most of them, the EU has one or the other status of observer, of enhanced observer, sometimes of full participant, sometimes even of member, in very few places. But I mean, there is some variety there. But the Security Council, the sad answer is, there is no observer participation. You could say, well, let's change the rules, but of course you are knocking against this Westphalian construct where especially the P5 have a veto right, not just on the substance of resolutions, but also on the whole reform of the Security Council architecture. You could say, well, maybe the second best idea is what we do now under the Lisbon Treaty, because with the Lisbon Treaty, we have the possibility of the High Representative and or the EU ambassador for the EU in New York to address the Security Council when, say, there is a common position and so on. And our High Representative has been to New York. I think a month ago on Europe Day, she spoke again to the to the Security Council. But to be honest, it's a very weak position, and I have sometimes very undiplomatically called this a tourist status, because you're just visiting, you're making a point and you're disappearing again. The real talks in the Security Council are without the EU. Our members who sit on the Security Council are there, and they are supposed to share information with us, and some of them do. But, I mean, the idea is the EU itself doesn't participate directly in the works, and especially not in the important negotiations of the Security Council, because that takes place behind closed doors. It's not that beautiful room with a horse-shaped table and so on, where people can sit in the back in the audience, where you have the feeling, global governance in action. No, the real action is in a closed door behind that public auditory. So, I mean, we are not there. And then, of course, you have to ask yourself, should we be there? I would say ideally, yes. But if we are not allowed in, the fallback position is that our member states should act as agents for the European interest. That is actually a rule under the treaty. The lawyers call this the duty of sincere cooperation. It is an obligation under CFSP. It is also an obligation elaborated by the European Court of Justice. But it doesn't work always well, because many of our member states, when they sit in the security, they suddenly feel like a great power, the place of action. And they sometimes tend to forget that they're also part of the EU, and that it is good to coordinate and, you know, come with common positions and proposals. But I hope, again, as I said, with Brexit and so on, there is in any event a need for us in the European Union to get our act together. Okay. All these other points, it's just too much, because, for instance, a definition of global governance, nice start, there are thousands of definitions. But I think what is very important that we sometimes forget them, because indeed here we focus on the multilateral clubs, and I think it's natural because Europe is multilateral, we want to engage with multilateral institutions and so on. But global governance is far more than that. It's about basically all the actors and all the processes, whether formal or informal, whether public or private, that have a bearing upon coping with global issues. And you know, that makes this concept very difficult to grasp, but it's actually very interesting for an actor like the European Union, because as you rightly said, Russia and China don't like that concept because it disempowers them. They want to see the state to be the central actor. Those non-state actors, those private clubs which set private standards for the global economy and so on. I think they don't like that. Well, and I'm not saying I like that. I mean, there are serious problems of legitimacy, accountability, and so on also with private standard setters. But these are things we can engage in as European Union. I've written a couple of papers about, for instance, how the EU can engage with private standard setting processes. We have certain ways of coping with that, and some of the EU laws already refer to that. We can, in a certain way, have an impact on that. Let's not forget, because we always look at the external action, but one of our most powerful tools for international action is our internal legislation, which applies to 500 million citizens, and which is very influential for the rest of the world. So it's something, it's a kind of power that we don't, that we're not sufficiently aware of right now. It brings me to another point that was raised about economic foundations, the need for stronger foundations. Indeed, we don't have a full-fledged economic union. There are many things where we are still very disunited in the European Union. This being said, we can't afford the luxury of first uniting incrementally and then start coping with the world outside of our borders. The world is not waiting for us. It's one of the typical things we Europeans, in all of our institutional reform processes, Maastricht, Amsterdam, Nice, Lisbon, what have you, we've always been coping with our internal reforms. But I think we have insufficiently kept pace with how quickly the world around us is changing. And we've been taken by surprise time and again. Arab Spring, Syria, what have you. I mean, all the time we see like reactive policies. I remember when I was a student in Harvard 30 years ago that Stanley Hoffman was basically saying about the then European Political Cooperation, the EPC, it is basically a reactive policy. It's a kind of, we Europeans, we deplore this, we deplore that. We have largely improved on that, and I think current CFSP, EAS, and so on is far, far better than where we come from with the EPC. But still, we are not enough anticipating. Which begs a question, if I may say so, for academia: where is the intelligence? Where is the capacity of being really, doing really forward thinking, really seeing the long-term tendencies? There are a couple of very interesting Commission reports, like Commission 2050 and so on. But I think overall we're very poor at that. Who has seen the migration crisis coming? I've been asking all peoples from the institutions, they were pointing to each other. Nobody basically told me who has the figures and who has been able to see migratory trends. I think we really have to get our act also together with regard to this critical think and long-term strategic capacity. Okay, well, I've already said so much. Let the other speakers say something.
Thanks a lot, Amelia.
Again, spoiled for choice. There's a spectrum of roles in terms of who are we and who should we engage with. And I'd like to see more work done on the choice that arises from this. The EU as a driver and a catalyst. We're more familiar with the EU as a bank, perhaps, and EU as a normative actor. But I'd like to disaggregate that a little bit. EU as a patron, a regional patron, EU as a legal facilitator, EU as a stage setter, etc. EU as a milieu goal setter. In terms of who we should work with, I mean, it's all too easy just to say, well, like-minded folks, you know, just the groups that we're familiar with, regional organizations that the European Union helped build. That's fine. I think they're sufficient. But I think also there are a variety of much, much tougher states and non-state actors out there who aren't even partners, but with whom it's necessary to work with. And I don't, for example, see really enough free thinking and like-mindedness between the G20, for example, and the European Union. There's so much more could be done there. I think that's an absolutely lost opportunity. Choice. How do we choose? This is really absolutely the core of it. Which is the cause? Sequencing. Should we start with Europe? There was a point made at the beginning. We should attend first to the problems of Europe. I get the sense we're swinging now, in a sense, beyond the critical animus of the Eurozone crisis. And I think we can afford now to look in terms of our external strength and ways in which it can be deployed in terms of external responsiveness. And I think what's the connective tissue between Europe inside and Europe outside, of course, are EU rules. But I think in terms of making that a form of global governance, we still haven't seen that structured enough. You answered the UN reform. That was great. I was taking lots of notes. You didn't answer the trilemma thing. Oh, maybe I'll come back to that. Multilateralism and whether it is strengthened or weakened by global governance and vice versa. That's an unhappy little piece of logic there. I think we have seen some strengthening. I think we've seen the strengthening of multilateralism boosting global governance. It's generally the integrationist logic. An example would be the ICC. But have we seen, obviously, the opposite? And I promised I wouldn't use the word Brexit, being the only British/Canadian in the room. Anytime CETA comes up, I'm a Brit. Anytime it's Brexit, I'm Canadian. So I think in terms of variable geometry, that's a convenient get-out clause for looking at ways of loosening some of the more difficult strictures of integration. And I feel that it's too easy a logic for us to be able to engage with it at this point. I love the points about innovation and marketing. That's great. Maybe we need more business in terms of our ability to focus on policy, particularly foreign policy. And you're right, economic innovation and social innovation go hand in hand. H2020 research has taught us this. But the role of marketing itself shows us about brand Europe. And I'm sorry to resort to cliches here, but I think you're right. I think we are strong in education here, and our ability to market our strength and our ability to market something like H2020 or Erasmus Plus or Jean Monnet. And less good, perhaps, at understanding and making use of and regulating and making Europe a patron of intellectual property rights. And you gave us a kind of nice dyad, if you like, between knowledge on one side and know-how on the other. That's nice. I'm going to pinch that. Tangible and intangible. I got the sense that you have a sort of a supply chain on one side and a value chain on the other. That's the way things are beginning to sort of divide up. In terms of education, it simply means we're going to have to really get a step ahead. Digital education, obviously, as a catalyst to the digitized economy. And again, that's something that we can build into various aspects of multilateral Europe and expand and deploy as well. Internships, digital internships, EU internships that allow us to school our youth in the very processes of global governance as well. And I'm going to end on the multi-layered. Who was that? Who? That's going to annoy me for hours, days now, which is great. Multi-level, multi-layer. There's a vector with variable geometry there, but I think that it goes beyond that. And I immediately wrote down macro, meso, and micro, which is the unholy trinity of global, regional, and member states. But I get the sense that perhaps not quite enough thinking has been going on in the top two. We're very, very good in Europe about the symbiotic connection, economic and political, between micro and meso, because we've striven so hard to make member state and regional integration dynamics work. But we're now less good, perhaps, at making regional and global work. And perhaps some of those disjunctures are beginning to come home to roost. And some of them is the difference between the ideological and process-based definitions of globalism and globalization that you mentioned. I think I'll finish there. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'll turn it over to Filiberto, who has the grateful task of sort of summing all that up. But again, I mean, please do feel free to pick up on some of these issues, and particularly also, of course, commenting on how the EU can take this on.
Thank you very much. I found the discussion very rich, and I believe many contributions were really of strong values, and therefore, rather than trying to give us answer and so on, I would rather say what I take back, and possibly, it will be part of our internal reflection. In terms of the global governance, I think here there were like at least three sort of poles. One is, let's say, the more traditional way of thinking that global governance through the multilateralism, the UN system, and so on. And this is certainly, let's say, a fundamental part of it. There was also, I think, especially from you, Amelia, and others, about look at global governance as the sum of many different ways of addressing issues, from bilateral agreements to bi-regional or whatever kind of agreements that we are able, formal and informal processes. And certainly this is a very rich area where we can act as a European Union as maybe a source of inspiration in terms of norm setting. I was professionally very much involved, for instance, with region-to-region negotiation of the so-called economic partnership agreement. I can tell you that it has been a very hard work that has continued for almost 2 decades, and it is still sort of a non-completed process. But I see a lot of values in these processes. And then maybe a third pole was about let's look at the global order as a starting from home. So the Europeanization of the processes, so that if we invest in our legal capacity or in our economic capacity, in our potential in terms of the projection of our knowledge, productive capacity, marketing capacity, and so on, maybe, and also from our values, we can from there build up, let's say, a better globalized, a better global governance, including about globalization. So I take that all this cannot really be opposed one to each other. We shall basically play with all this level, and I think the European Union is making all efforts to work on all these different levels, and the global strategy is certainly a contribution to that, in the sense that try to look not at specific geographical or specific challenges, but try to look at what are the systemic issues that we need to address. Maybe the other point was about whether we should select priorities, select partners, some partners rather than others, some priorities rather than others, or continue somehow to be holistic in our approach, trying to have relations with everybody and try to touch on all issues. I'm afraid that on this we have a sort of péché d'origine. I mean, we are a union of 27 member states, and each one of these states have inside regions, towns, and you name it, in terms of specificity, knowledge, languages, and so on. So I think this makes our strength and our weakness in the sense, but certainly I think the strength part is much more than the weak part. So in the end, I believe we don't have other opportunities, I would not say other choices, but other opportunities that really working in an holistic way and touching in trying to address all issues and working with all partners. Well, certainly we will be brought to establish priorities in certain period, in certain situation, but overall I don't think we are in a position to say, okay, now we invest on the Silk Belt or we invest on the Arctic because this is the challenge of the future. No, I think we cannot do that. I will stop there, and I also count on what will come out from the other groups so that we can integrate it in our professional work. But anyway, I think one of the aim of the conference that was to put together people involved more in the policy making and those who are involved in the academic work, I think it's a good success in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you so much to you, Filiberto, and once again also to Jan and Amelia for kicking off the debate, but also really thanks to all of you to have sort of challenged some of the assumptions here, but also each other, which I think is something that we hopefully will continue over the course of tonight and tomorrow, but I hope much beyond that, because indeed it's supposed to be the beginning of a sort of longer term exchange. I also already thank Anita for having this scribbled away. You were right, Jan, it's not in the program, but we thought before we then sort of now condense all of those into some results, we'll give you the chance to at least briefly stretch your legs, grab a refreshment if you'd like, and then we come back here to hear also about the results of the other groups.